So I'm pleased to welcome you to the last session of today, our keynote lecture by Professor Nitasha Kaul from Westminster University, London. Professor Kaul is a multidisciplinary academic, novelist, economist, poet, and public intellectual. She holds a chair in politics, international relations, and critical interdisciplinary studies, and is the director of the Center for the Study of Democracy at the University of Westminster, London. She has published widely on themes relating to democracy, political economy, Hindutva, Indian politics, misogyny, technology, artificial intelligence, identity, the rise of right-wing nationalism, feminist and post-colonial critiques, as well as small states in geopolitics regions of Bhutan, Kerala, and Kashmir. Professor Kaul is the recipient of multiple research grants and awards for her research, writing, and activism. She is the author of over 150 publications, including, 7 singly authored or edited scholarly and literary books. Book chapters in numerous critical and groundbreaking edited collections, plus peer-reviewed original research articles in numerous journals across humanities and the social sciences. Her books include the monograph Imagining Economics Otherwise, Encounters with Identity Difference, and political fiction telling the stories of conflict and identity, such as her novel Future Tense and the Man Asian Library Prize shortlisted novel Residue, that was the first novel in English by a Kashmiri woman author. Her lecture is entitled Misogyny, Authoritarianism, and the Future of Democracy. Professor Kaul, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for inviting me to your conference. And like the other speakers who are unable to join in person, are you able to hear me though? Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, perfect. Okay, one isn't sure with technology. Okay. So yes, I'm very sorry that it wasn't possible to join in person. I would have really liked to. I tried to attend as many sessions as I could during the course of the conference so far. Alas, I'll miss most of them tomorrow because I have to teach. But thank you. This is an incredibly important topic. And like the other speakers from yesterday, I would like to emphasize as well how significant the question of shades of democracy and authoritarianism is in the present. Another focus area of the many papers that I've heard is about history, and historiography is at the core of multiple contestations that are very political and very much to do with democracy. Thank you for also, finally, for the generous introduction and for the details. I think the point to take away from that is that critical interdisciplinary work, which is something that I have engaged in over a long period of time, makes sense to me because it allows us to shift away from various kinds of methodological nationalisms and other kinds of ideological blind spots that often prevent us from seeing similar dynamics at work in different contexts or geographical locations. And with what I'm going to talk to you about today, which is essentially what I would argue is a relationship between how we think of authoritarianism and de-democratization, misogyny, and what it means for the future of democracy, I want to draw examples from different parts of the world precisely for this. The right-wing, the transnational aspect specifically of the right-wing successes in the present global moment are remarkable and yet still often missed. I think that I would like to draw upon, again, some of the points that were emphasized yesterday by the speakers, that the link between, I think it was Rachel that mentioned it, the link between de-democratization and moral decline, the fact that thinking is an important act of hope in the present, and that we are witnessing new forms of authoritarianism. And for me, I would hopefully today talk to you about what I think those new forms are, or how we might want to understand them, especially if we take seriously the idea of gender as power. But I think also involved in all of this are other kinds of things that, as political scientists, people often miss, such as the role of affect, the role of rhetoric, the role of online technologies and social media, which play an important role in the current global transformation. Another thing that I think struck me in your discussion so far is the question that you were pondering this morning about the relationship between nationalism and democracy. And in fact, in all of these, I think the interventions of taking gender seriously are important. Do remember that dissent in democracy is often labeled anti-national. Calls for accountability are often labeled anti-national, and which gives us a particular sense of what the nation is supposed to be. And finally, I think the other thing I want to comment on is something I heard this morning about the joint struggle against theocracy and autocracy. I want to underline how often polarization and polarized perspectives, especially if we're talking about entrenched conflict, tend to predominate, and certainly the Israel and the conflict, the ongoing conflict in your part of the world is not something that I deeply study. However, I do want to say that our geopolitical imaginaries of cooperation, of oppression, of the joint struggles of people who are often facing competing militarisms, masculinities, demands of extremist religion and of fundamentalist forms of power are shared. Okay, so in terms of what I want to argue, it's really if I were to put it in sort of a sentence, I would say that I want to put it to you that undermining of democracy is made possible in significant part by misogyny, which increases insecurity, and we need to pay attention to how it works as political strategy in different global contexts, pay a lot more attention than we do, in other words. The rise of the current global right wing that, for me, a striking fact that I put to you is that it isn't happening in just one country. It is a transnationally relevant phenomenon. And if we go back to a few years ago, we can see the precursors of Trump in Modi, and perhaps Modi in Erdogan, and so on. So for me, this work began. This particular strand of my work began in 2016. In fact, November 2016. When when Trump's coming to power, his victory in the elections over Hillary Clinton sought to be explained almost overwhelmingly by commentators on the right as well as on the left as the result of a reaction to economic woes. It isn't unusual to find something very similar being argued often, even in the present, on the in November 2024. That this is a reaction to economic woes. Well, I think that's the first thing to sort of challenge in terms of the fact that the working class, the argument that implicitly the white working class argument does not explain the fact that an overwhelming majority of working class other kinds of voters, say for instance black female voters in the US, do not vote for Trump. Doesn't mean they don't have the economic woes. It is also the fact that the support for Trump comes from people who are not facing those economic woes. So there is something at work more than just a reaction to a certain kind of economic arrangement that dispossesses people. And in the background, it might also help to think of what I've called post-colonial neoliberal nationalism, in that these projects, these particular kinds of right-wing projects, systematically employ a combination of neoliberalism and nationalism, which are otherwise understood to be opposed forces as historically. And this is not an argument I'll develop in great detail. I want to be speaking mostly of misogyny, but the fact that they combine neoliberal and nationalist arguments in their, in the production of their governmentality in a way that is that allows for useful contradictions, that is also combined with, so these leaders are neoliberal and nationalist at the same time. They are also post-colonial, by which I don't mean that they have, that this is something chronologically after colonial era, but that these are political projects that promise a future as the return to a glorious past. And in certain parts of the world, that past is a past of imperial nostalgia. And in other parts of the world, that is a past of pre-colonial nativist purity. And what a response to this, in my view, requires us to refuse the distinction between political economy and cultural politics as if they have their own very separate and separable logics, that in fact the idea of the economy and the idea of the nation are often co-constituted in how these projects work. And these projects are led by a certain kind of leader that I've called ELMA, electorally legitimated misogynist authoritarian. The electorally legitimated, because I want to emphasize that these are leaders that come to power, but that they do not have a substantive commitment to democratic principles in how they function. Misogynist authoritarians, because I think a key distinguishing aspect of the way in which their authoritarianism unfolds itself is their use of misogyny. And now I think the next important thing to sort of focus on is, what do I mean by misogyny? Well, firstly, I think that misogyny is closely related to political legitimacy, that these kinds of leaders, the ELMA leaders, the electorally legitimated misogynist authoritarians, come to power claiming a monopoly on nationalism. They challenge all of their critics as anti-national and their political opponents as anti-national. They also claim to be challenging neoliberalism, but in all of the instances profit from crony capitalism and are often mired in explicit and often evidence-based assertions of corruption, especially to do with their cronies, with their preferred cronies. So this is a phenomenon that we see in multiple countries globally, multiple democracies globally. And the reason that I want to be talking about democracies and the de-democratization and the way in which authoritarianism is being electorally entrenched in these in democracies is because authoritarians, as we know, are explicitly authoritarian regimes where in an election it isn't possible for a political opponent to come to power. We know that there has been a lot more work looking at the ways in which those systems are gendered through the strongman rule. But if we think of democracies in the present, and it is a very important, and sort of worrisome thing that globally liberal democracy is perhaps at its lowest in a very long time. Most regimes are hybrid. You've all been referring to various Freedom House indices. I mean, the world's largest democracy, I will put that in inverted commas, currently has been ranked partly free. I'm referring to India here, on a country I've worked on for a long time. Think about the US and even in the first few days of the second Trump victory, what we have seen might be the future scenario. Certainly, I don't think it's out of the question to argue that there is a sort of very strong authoritarian, I would even say proto-fascist slide in where we are headed. Now, why this is important to look at in multiple countries, and the ones that I've looked at in a lot more detail are the United States, Philippines, India, Brazil, and Turkey. So in all of these countries, the political projects of modification, Dutertismo, Trumpism, Bolsonarismo, and Erdoganism have exhibited various commonalities. The commonalities, they may have different specific targets in their own individual countries, but what is undeniable is that in each of these cases, misogyny has been a consistent and common thread in their hate speech. This matters, and I will just sort of go further to explain why it matters. But I think before that, even just to pause that this misogyny obviously takes different forms in the different contexts. For someone like Erdogan or Modi, it is a protective sort of misogyny, the sort of the paternalist protective sort of misogyny, whereas in the case of Trump or someone like Bolsonaro or certainly someone like Duterte, it is a predatory kind of misogynist speech acts that we see. However, in all of these cases, there is that common thread, whatever else might be different in terms of the actual things that they target. Now, what one means by misogyny historically was understood that misogyny is an individual attribute. It is something that that is exemplified by a hatred or disgust towards women as women. It is something that is the prerogative historically of men, that being the idea. However, the one kind of thing that I want to clarify before going on to my own argument is that feminist philosophers have now provided more ameliorative accounts of the distinction between misogyny and sexism. So, for instance, Kate Mann's work is what I'm referring to, where she argues that sexism is the justificatory branch of patriarchy as opposed to misogyny, which is the law enforcement branch of patriarchy. In other words, sexism is what provides the rationales for why men and women should be doing what they should be doing. And misogyny is the thing that allows for punishment when women step out of line. Now, what I've done in my work is to take that further and argue that misogyny is not, in fact, only about embodied men and embodied women, because when we look at these political projects, they exhibit levels of support from certain kinds of individuals who happen to be women in those societies who also support these projects. And certainly there's nothing per se that prevents physically, an embodied woman to be leading a similar kind of a project. So misogyny is more than just about individual attitudes of individual men towards individual women, but it is about how the gender itself works as power. In that, there is a hierarchical understanding where feminization is used as a prelude to devaluation. In other words, the non-conforming feminine, the feminist, is seen as something that can be devalued and that can then be legitimately attacked. And the way through which this common sense is created are the speech acts of these leaders and the kinds of things that these projects normalize. So, anything that, for instance, can be associated with care. Now, if it's care for environment or care for human rights or, care for society, all of those projects can be feminized as being projects that involve caring, for instance, sustainability as a feminine projects, that these are things that are feminine, and therefore by designating them as such and understanding them as such, they are feminized, and that is then as a prelude to how they are devalued and seen as less legitimate and as amenable to being attacked. So that, so for instance, the non-conforming women can be justifiably silenced and punished. It's also the anti-national critics and dissenters and activists who can be punished for stepping out of line or questioning these leaders' political projects. They can be explicitly feminized as a prelude to devaluing and subduing them. And environment and climate change is one where we see this clear evidence of this. They can be tarnished by association with feminist challenges or viewed as part of an unholy anti-national nexus of indigenous rights or critical race perspectives or LGBTQ identities, minority rights, and so on. So the challenges to power and the ability to dissent that are conceptually very central to democratic systems are, in theory, are delegitimized by these, by the Elma leader type projects as deserving justifiable punishment because they challenge or threaten a certain patriarchal social order of family, territory, and nation state, and this matters because this legitimizes violence against any body or community or issue or identity that can be constructed as feminine in general and as feminist in particular. Therefore, the anti-national enemies of these leaders are can span the range, as I said, from human rights activists to environmental activists. And there's I don't think it's possible for me to provide you actual Speech Act examples, but I can direct you to my work where there is a whole repository of how this kind of speech matters. And this isn't just speech. It isn't just certain people who have a certain idea of, just a bad view of the world or of other people, because this speech is powerful in that it shapes the entry of people into all kinds of speech, and who can be seen and judged as being legitimate, as a legitimate proponent or interlocutor in the public sphere on what, and that is where I think the link between the speech and the ties to the policies that are enacted by these leaders is very much in resonance. So that in fact they are not only saying these things but doing something different. The speech is a key part of what enables the consent for various kinds of, democratic rights rollbacks and other kinds of policies which directly affect those who have been constructed in line with this kind of, with this understanding of, what I just put to you as this understanding of misogyny. So, and I'll just as a footnote again mention that the idea of economic difficulties has been sort of, empirically found not to be the relevant explanants, say, for instance, in the 2016 US elections, where economic difficulties were found to be less powerful than attitudes on race and gender, even after controlling for partisanship, ideology, etc. So that's something to remember, that we have, I think, for too long, we have been very closely tied to this notion that right-wing successes or authoritarian successes are the result of failures that precede them, and that they are just reactive, they're inevitable, they were, it's teleological, they were meant to happen. However, I think that doesn't do justice to the many ways in which these kinds of projects actually involve a lot of, almost hard work and clever work and the making of legitimacy for these projects, in which, again, misogyny plays an important role. Specifically, it works as a political strategy in several different ways. But firstly, historically, and some of my later work, I worked with psychologists, and we examined the link between misogyny, authoritarianism, and climate change, again, in democracies. And for instance, and this is before the current US election, and we found that there was a first actual empirical evidence of this correlation between people's attitudes to gender, Trump voters specifically, attitudes to gender, to the environment, in terms of denying that climate change was real, and to democracy and the preference for more authoritarian forms of rule. So there is a there is a kind of psychological research would tell us that misogyny and authoritarian or anti-feminist dispositions are strongly correlated, and that this again holds irrespective of socioeconomic status or whether the people are men or women, and in fact that gendered structure, that idea of traditional gendered structures and roles are strongly correlated. So therefore, by activating what is already sort of, there's an already existing, of course, historical consonance of beliefs, by activating that through these speech acts and through the role of, again, affect and rhetoric and all of this, it makes that useful in enrollment of supporters into such projects. It is also useful then to silence critics and political opponents by feminizing them as ineffective or lacking in autonomy. During the COVID era, numerous instances where all kinds of leaders said that even something like wearing a mask or taking basic precautions, health precautions, was a feminine thing to do, and they used the speech directly against their political opponents. For instance, Biden, and this is something that Biden should carry a purse along with his mask. That there was something feminine about wearing a mask. In a moment, I'll also tell you that this is also actually correlated with how people view concerns, care for the environment. So that if you're carrying, research shows us that if you're carrying, reusable, recyclable, sustainable sorts of bags and things like that, then both men and women see that as the feminine thing to be doing. So there's it allows, what misogyny does is it allows for a prejudice sort of mobility, if I may put it like that, in activation and strategic use of this. So therefore, misogyny becomes central to the acceptable terms of political participation, agency, claims making, identity. Who gets to be seen as valid, a valid person speaking on something, or whom should we pay attention to? Who can be delegitimized? The flip side, of course, of that is a very clear instance of this is, and on this particular thing, there's a lot of work, online gender trolling and how it's used to silence women, but also silence speech that is about non-conforming feminine or feminist, or how that's called anti-national, how that's seen as the weak thing to do, etc. Secondly, it allows for patterns of useful contradictions on gender, so that often these leaders and projects that undermine democracies use feminist and political gains to promote conservative patriarchal ends via either policies that don't deliver in practice because they are never intended to do so, or via policy institutions that are headed by people who oppose the reasons why those institutions exist in the first place. So you could have the current, of course, U.S. context gives us a very clear instance of how this has been working, so that you could appoint somebody to, you could appoint but it isn't just the U.S., it's also several other countries where, for instance, you could appoint someone to head a, women's affairs ministry or department. And in my published work, there's a lot more specific examples I give of this across different countries, that you could appoint somebody to head a human rights, ministry, who could be a black person, and they would say that, there's no such thing as racism. Or you could appoint women who, so that you're doing both. In effect, you're appointing a woman to a role, but that person, the specific person who is appointed to that role, probably doesn't think that women ought to have rights over their own bodies, or that women should conform to certain kinds of roles. So it allows for these very useful contradictions that can silence dissent, and also simultaneously enact policies and legislations that, so they will enact policies and legislations that challenge sexism, thereby delegitimizing critics of misogyny by saying that, you're overreacting. We've got, women and minorities in these relevant positions, but that then is part of this. That then is part of the way in which this political project works. It's systematic. It's not, it's not intentional, but it's not unintentional. But it's also not something that is. It's something that uses these feminist and progressive gains, in fact, to undermine them. And lastly, more relevant to conflict, but I think across various kinds of contexts, misogyny allows for a gendered biopolitics of the nation, whereby these particular kinds of leaders are seen as the only ones that can protect or modernize or develop the country. And these authoritarian leaders, as I mentioned before, can restore its pride, maintain its glory. It helps entrench their policies as strong, even when they might be sort of rather counterintuitive. So if you think about, a country's leader being strong, their positions aren't what you would think of conventionally as strong positions, but because of how this is constructed, because their opponents are targeted as weak and feminine, in effect, whatever they do becomes the strong position, the strong man often position. And that challenges to it are delegitimized as feminine or feminist or anti-national. There is a key role of threat in increasing authoritarianism. They present themselves as this kind of bulwark, which is rooted in militarized masculinity. These positions can then be used to target others as weak, enemies of the nation, those who will sort of, who will make the nation feminine and weak. Again, the association of feminine and weak is relevant there. And examples of this range all the way from historical examples to how in the present green behavior, and by green behavior, pro-environment behavior, or thinking that climate change is real or we ought to do anything about the environment, is seen as the unmanly thing to do, is seen as a feminine thing to do. And this kind of political project has been studied for a whole, for a whole lot of ways. But what we haven't had enough of, in my view, is the way in which it uses gender as power. It takes that entry point thing of misogyny, where feminization is a prelude to devaluation and then potentially to being attacked, as a way that can be used against human rights activists, against critical journalists, against environment, against those who would argue for pro-environment policies, and that this isn't just that rhetoric matters, and that this isn't just something at the level of performance, that this actually has a clear link to the sorts of policies that we are able to enact, and the rollback of the kinds of democratic rights that people previously had. So, and as I mentioned to you before, there's a sort of more detailed work that I've done, but it's also empirically interesting that we see some of these attitudes, say, for example, in the case of the US, from 2016, this becomes more significant. So, for instance, if we look at climate, attitudes on climate policy, then the effect of what psychologists call hostile sexism and climate change denial and opposition to climate policy in surveys has become much greater from 2016 onwards, which shows us that what is happening isn't just, that gendered language actually matters, that a certain kind of entrenchment of gender as in these hierarchical terms makes a difference in policy and shifts the wider common sense. So that, again, I would go back to that point that any projects that can be constructed as involving care, whatever kind of care it is, for whoever that care is or whatever that care is targeted at, can be constructed and perceived as feminine. And this shows us that the idea that it isn't just, I would argue, biological sex, but misogyny that is the more important variable that allows for this kind of prejudice mobility, whereby ELMA, this kind of electorally legitimated misogynist authoritarian rhetoric, has effect in that they can shape public opinion, affect citizens' preferences, and that, again, this is where the link to social media and other kinds of compromised information comes in, is that is most effective where political awareness is not very high. So that we do have, in fact, most recently, we now have empirical evidence that even what the soon-to-be President Trump's tweets and rhetoric, that they actually undermine confidence in democratic processes, and that this is something that you can see that for every very recent research that I was just reading the other day, that you can actually see that during, for instance, January 6th events, every single tweet or every single message that was put out can be linked to a greater potential for increase in violence in terms of the supporters' actions. So that these aren't just words. These are, of course, they're not entirely invented. These prejudices are not invented, obviously, by these leaders, but they are operationalized in a way that work as political strategy quite systematically across very different contexts that are from the global north and the global south, the West and the non-West, that involve countries with different majority religions, Islam in Turkey, Hinduism in India, Christianity in the US and Philippines. So these are very different contexts, but there is this very salient commonality to them. I mean, specifically, if we're talking about the world's most powerful and the world's biggest democracy by number, in the India and the US case, I could literally just tell you numerous term for term similarities in literally policy, appointments, that just the whole project, the nature of it is remarkably similar, and in spite of course, the other different contexts, there is a dynamic here that's transnational and relevant. And this also, I guess, the caveat that I mentioned at the start, but also that these kinds of attitudes and this idea of misogyny can and is also able to be internalized by women. We see this in voting behaviors. That's a very clear sort of in sort of one way of indexing this quite clearly, but that there is a coherent set of beliefs that attitudes to gender map with attitudes to preference for, authoritarianism, preference for authoritarian setups, preference for lack of care for the environment, or thinking that, again, climate change isn't real, combined with the attack on women's rights that is currently global, vastly accelerated, and with probably much worse to come. And the fact that these are policies that keep getting enacted in real time in multiple democracies shows us that misogyny isn't just a thing that, that gender studies scholars or certain other kinds of people need to worry about, or the way in which gender is, the way in which we're thinking about the authoritarian entrenchment in democracies. I think gender is a very important way to think through the pathologies of contemporary democracy, and in how power in these systems is being, achieved and sustained, and because that is how we eventually get to what one might do about it, which is something that worries us all. So I will go back to the exact point that I started out, which is that misogyny increases insecurity through the undermining of democracy. It is happening in multiple countries. It isn't just an incidental fact. It isn't just something that is outside of other real politics. It is a part of how real politics is being constructed, how power is being gained, and how challenges to that power are being silenced in the present. And understanding these sorts of these links more analytically is important if we are to sort of, if we are to, yes, of course, if we are to save, if we are to save democracy as a system, because for the many things that it doesn't do very well, it is, I think, still the only sort of thing that it's the least worst thing, and I think it is part of an ancient human dream that has been haunted by various kinds of hierarchies of wealth and power as far back as humankind can remember. And nonetheless, it is a system that is in need of championing, because it is our only guarantee against for rights for all kinds of people, for asking of accountability from those who govern us, and at present it is I think that it's under huge duress and is sort of existentially threatened, whereby it's pretty serious that citizens in democracies now don't see democracies as being essential, and will often be sort of what's the word, repeating, I guess, the talking points of authoritarians about how democracy is sort of like an expendable system. This isn't just something that is happening in authoritarian countries, where it's always been an enforced view, but this is something that increasingly people in democracies are unable to appreciate the value of the sorts of rights and freedoms that have been very hard won, and for especially for minorities and for women. So I think I'll end there, because I want to have the Q&A and the discussion.